from Madras Mission Hospital. After a successful first session last week, we welcome you, sir, to deliberate on your lecture on hemodynamics pressure tracings in cath lab, approach to interpretation and analysis. And I hereby accord you a warm welcome on the from the Delhi chapter of CSI. Dr. Shiv Kumar, please, you can start your deliberation.
Can I share my screen now?
Yeah, you can start your screen, sir. The panelists, Dr. Sumod and Dr. Ramakrishnan, will be there to take questions in the end and to conclude the lecture. You can start, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. In today's session, we will be discussing about oximetry, the basis of calculating a cardiac output, how to calculate shunts, whether it is left, right, or right to left, and how to make those calculations. What are the artifacts and what are the assumptions? How to calculate vascular resistance and decision on operability on individual lesions. So basically, if you see what is cardiac output is defined as the amount of blood that is delivered to the systemic circulation per unit time. So the unit time is minute.
Screen share.
Are you able to see the slides?
No, sir. You are not able to see your screen.
Hello.
I have shared my.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It's visible, but not the slide output, sir. It's in
full screen. Full screen is needed.
Not in full screen.
Is it now seen in full screen?
It's fine.
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Fine. So the first definition, cardiac output is defined as the amount of blood delivered to the systemic circulation per unit time. The amount of blood that crosses the systemic capillary blood per unit time, and the per unit time is per minute. So how was this derived? It goes back to what is called the Fick principle. Fick principle states that the uptake of a substance by a given organ is equal to the blood flow into the arteriovenous concentration difference. So the amount of blood flow to the organ, let us now take the organ as lungs. So the amount of blood flow to the organ, the amount of blood that is going into the lungs.
So, sorry, sir. Actually, you are stuck at the first slide, sir.
Is it moving?
No, sir.
Not really.
Okay, just a second. I will.
Hello.
Is it better now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay. The Fick principle. Now, is the slide moving?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. The Fick principle states that the uptake of a substance by an organ is equal to the blood flow to the organ multiplied by arteriovenous oxygen difference. So let us apply it to the lungs. The amount of blood flow to the organ is QP. So the QP multiplied by arteriovenous oxygen concentration difference, that is the PV minus PA, this is equal to the uptake of the substance. So the uptake of the substance is oxygen consumption. So the arteriovenous oxygen difference goes to the denominator if you want to find out what is the blood flow to the organ. So in the absence of a left to right shunt or a right to left shunt, the systemic blood flow is equal to pulmonary blood flow. And so this is the basis of Fick principle. So Cardiac output is equal to oxygen consumption divided by arteriovenous oxygen difference. Adolf Fick was a German physician who proposed this concept. This was way back in the 18th centuries. He never tested it himself, but the principles are so sound, it's so solid principles. And this is the basis of all the measurements in the cath lab. The total uptake of a substance by an organ is equal to blood flow to the organ multiplied by arteriovenous oxygen concentration difference. So this is his definition. So now we are going to now dissect this formula completely. The first component is oxygen consumption. How can we measure the oxygen consumption of a person in a given unit time? Some of the two methods that were used in the past were, one is called as metabolic rate meter method or polarographic method. The second is called Douglas bag method. Before understanding these two methods, let us try to understand a little bit about what is the normal oxygen consumption. One metabolic equivalent means a standard person who is not doing any work at all, and the amount of oxygen that he consumes is called one metabolic equivalent. In general, it is 3.5 ml per minute per kilogram body weight for a normal standard person. So let's assume it's a 70 kilo man, it's 245 ml, and if you index it, it is 150 ml per minute per meter square. Women have got a reduced muscle mass, and so women will have a slightly smaller oxygen consumption. Infant will have a higher metabolic activity, so infant will have a slightly larger oxygen consumption. In general, consumption will be high if a person is febrile, if he is tachycardic, if he is agitated, anxious. First method, polarographic method or metabolic rate meter method. The person lies down with an oxygen hood and he takes in the air from the hood and he exhales it out. The air comes from outside, from the room, and so this is room air that is entering inside. You make a servo control here in such a way that you will be sucking the air out continuously throughout and maintain the amount of air that is coming out at an oxygen percentage of 20%. We all know that in room air it is 21% is the oxygen saturation, like the percentage of oxygen in the room air is 21%. So you adjust in such a way that this is 20% here. So this is basically a servo-controlled suction apparatus. And this is called as a metabolic rate meter. When this goes, the basic amount of room air that is entering inside will be equal. The amount of air that is entering into the meter will be what is coming inside, that is VR, plus what the person is expiring, that is VE, and subtract by what he is inspiring, VI. So this is the basis of understanding what is a metabolic rate meter. It might look very complex, but finally, since we are adjusting the amount of oxygen in the air that is getting collected through a servo control to be exactly 20%. So minus 0.21 minus 0.20. So this will come to 0.01 of the entire amount of air that is sucked by the machine. So if the machine has sucked in a particular given time 20 liters, then 0.01 of 20 liters, 200 ml is the VO2. So while the equipment looks complex, the information is very simple. The amount of air that gets sucked into the machine into 0.01 is the VO2, and this is metabolic rate meter method. Of course, there are some assumptions that the respiratory quotient is 1, which means we are taking that whatever is the amount of volume of air that is inspired by the patient is equal to the volume of air that is expired by the patient. The older Douglas bag method was using a mouthpiece and a nose clip. The entire expired air is collected through a valve into a Douglas bag, and it is collected for 3 full minutes in what is called as a Tissot spirometer. So the spirometer measures the volume, assesses what is the oxygen percentage, and tells us what is the oxygen consumption. Obviously, both these methods are going to be cumbersome. Before each cath to perform such an oxygen consumption is a cumbersome exercise, and even in many advanced cath labs, this is time consuming. So this is completely only for research. So what do? We rely on nomograms. What is this nomogram? One of the nomogram that is used in majority of the places is called a Lafarge graph or Lafarge and Mittinen's graph. There are two graphs, one for male and one for female. If you carefully look at this, this is oxygen consumption indexed for body surface area. It keeps increasing with the heart rate and it keeps reducing with the heart rate if the heart rate is lower or higher. And with age, it keeps reducing if the age is higher and it keeps increasing if the age is lower. Lafarge and Mittinen found out this on patients who are aged 3 to 40 at various heart rates. And similarly, they plotted another graph for females, again 3 to 40 years of age at varying heart rates. So this was published in 1970 out of data that was acquired between 1961 to 1967 at Boston Children's Hospital. A total of 879 patients were studied with sedation, what is called Lytic cocktail. Many of the current generation people may not know it at all. It is a combination of pethidine plus chlorpromazine plus promethazine. All these three together will produce a sort of a dissociate anesthesia, something similar to ketamine, and the patient will be in a very relaxed manner lying down. And this was one of the common methods of sedation even till about 20 years before. They used the Douglas bag method and the age group was between 3 to 40. Patients less than 3 years were not validated. They found out a regression equation, and the regression equation is volume of oxygen consumption is equal to a constant minus log of a constant, log of the age plus heart rate. So carefully see here, it is log of the age is the determinant and it is in a minus, it's actually in a, there is a minus symbol before this. So what does it infer? When age is less than 3 years of age, since age is logarithmically transformed, the estimated VO2 significantly increases in younger age. So if you go by Lafarge equation, the lesser and less the age, since it is in logarithmic proportion, you will have a higher oxygen consumption. So when we estimate it from the Lafarge equation, the estimated VO2 in less than 3 years will be quite high. But truly, if you try to measure, it will not be so high. So the error between the estimated to measured, the error became more and more whenever it was younger and younger child. And this was one of the contention of against using Lafarge formula. So they found out that Lafarge formula, whenever the VO2 is very, very low, they are overestimated. And whenever it is very high, they are underestimated. What is the difference between estimated and measured? Unlike the previous inaccurate Douglas bag method, today's methods are based on a very recent principle called respiratory mass spectrometry. What is respiratory mass spectrometry? It takes out a micro volume of the expired air and it can instantaneously tell what is the oxygen concentration, what is the carbon dioxide concentration in that small volume with great precision. But to be very precise, we should be able to get the entire expiratory air out analyzed. So this means the patient has to be mechanical ventilated, which means the patient has to be in a deeper level of sedation for extraction of the entire expired gas and quantifying the VO2. So obviously this means general anesthesia and sedation and mechanical ventilation are needed for respiratory mass spectrometry, and all these will reduce the cardiopulmonary work and reduce the metabolic rate And so the VO2 will reduce by 20 to 30% just because you are using a respiratory mass spectrometry. So now we can understand this, what is called as a overestimation here, which means you are telling in smaller and smaller age, I had a very, very high VO2 because of Lafarge formula. But when I use respiratory mass spectrometry, I am having much lower value. The basic principle itself, when you are putting a patient on mechanical ventilation, deep sedation and checking the VO2, that VO2 will be low. So we have to understand the difference between estimated and measured is not only the true difference, but it is also because of the difference in the methods adopted. So respiratory mass spectrometry measures the fractional proportion of different substances in a measure, in a quantum. So how it is done? The sample is taken from the ventilator and it goes down into the respiratory mass spectrometer, which actually is something like a vacuum tube. It keeps on suctioning out. So the entire air is sucked in. A small amount of that expired air is going through into a different chamber, which is called as a dispersion chamber, which splits out each and every molecule of oxygen, carbon dioxide, everything, and tells exactly what is the amount of oxygen that is consumed. So for this setup to be very precise, you need to have three limbs. This is the respiratory mass spectrometer. There is an inspiratory limb that assesses what is the inspiratory air oxygen. There is an end-tidal carbon dioxide and there is an expiratory limb. All these three things should be assessed carefully in order to get the very precise results. So if you have to ensure the accuracy on a respiratory mass spectrometry, you need to have a cuffed endotracheal tube, which means, let us assume a 3-month-old baby you are going to assess by the VO2 by a respiratory mass spectrometry. It's not going to be possible. You need to have what is called a steady state. That means the patient is sedated, paralyzed to avoid movement, agitation, pains, and this itself will have a reduction on the VO2. And when used in spontaneous breathing, it is not like respiratory mass spectrometry is not used in spontaneous breathing. If you go to the exercise labs, the sports medicine labs, they will also use respiratory mass spectrometry. But during such conditions, the precision of the measurement goes down to as low as just 5%, because a lot of contaminations will be there from the air that is coming out from externally. So when you are using it for precision, you need to be perfect, and that means you have to use a cuffed endotracheal tube, deeply anesthetized, sedated, and this is going to introduce its own difficulties. So to conclude, VO2 estimation ideally has to be done in the cath lab. Proper VO2 measurements are possible only with respiratory mass spectrometry, and absolutely no leak should be allowed. This needs intubation, sedation, cuffed tube, but this is not real world at all. So in patients who are in conscious sedation and spontaneous breathing, Lafarge is more appropriate. But now comes the question, Lafarge did not give data for less than 3 years. So let us see what is the recommendations. This is the 2019 recommendation by the Pulmonary Hypertension and Pulmonary Vascular Disease group. They say the preferred mode to perform a cardiac catheterization in a patient with pediatric pulmonary hypertensive vascular disease is when he is spontaneously breathing, either awake or moderately sedated. And obviously there is no emphasis on deeper levels of sedation, anesthesia, accurate VO2 measurement by respiratory mass spectrometry. Universally, it is understood and accepted that the estimated VO2 is good enough. Lafarge formula is practical. The formula is based on a constant with relation to age and in relation to heart rate. There are some other people who have assessed, some of them Bergstra on dye dilution method. There are methods that avoid this exponential and logarithmic equations. One such equation is called the Lundell formula. Lundell formula comes from Sweden on 504 patients, and this actually totally takes out the logarithmic relationship of the age. So this formula is something like a constant into weight plus constant into height plus constant into heart rate. So there is no logarithmic equation. And this particular study of 504 patients included both less than 3 years as well as more than 3 years. So this is yet another formula, but validated a little less. And the number of patients were also little less. There are some other simpler equations. Everybody wants something very simple. So from University of Texas, there is a Dermer formula, which is 125 plus or minus 25 ml per minute per square meter body surface area. And whenever the patient is sedated, they found it is 121 ml. And whenever the patient is fully awake, it is 132. So let us go to this simpler formula. 125 ml per minute per square meter body surface area. Now I go back to my original slide. How do we remember? One metabolic equivalent is 3.5 ml per minute per meter squared. A standard 70 kilo man will be 150 ml per minute per meter squared. A standard woman will be 125. A standard infant will be something like 180 to 200. So if you go by the Lafarge equation, go by it. But if you are not going by it, and if you want something very simple, very quick, applicable, use this. Male 150, female 125, child 175 to 200. So now, so far we have discussed oxygen consumption. Now we are going for the second, arteriovenous oxygen difference. To understand arteriovenous oxygen difference, we need to understand what is oxygen carrying capacity. Hemoglobin, 1 gram of hemoglobin, when you are fully saturating it with oxygen, can carry 1.36 ml of oxygen. So each 1 gram can carry 1.36 ml of oxygen. And if you multiply by the hemoglobin of the patient, you will get a number. Since the hemoglobin commonly in all our countries is measured as 14 gram per deciliter, we want to convert it into liter by putting 10 here. So hemoglobin into 10 into 1.36 is the oxygen carrying capacity. And this whole carrying capacity, percentage saturation is multiplied. For example, if it is arterial, 95% or 98%, so 95 by 100. If it is venous, then it may be 70%, so 70 by 100. So oxygen carrying capacity into 70 by 100 or oxygen carrying capacity into 95 by 100 is the oxygen content. How do we measure this oxygen saturation? We have to understand what is called as the Beer-Lambert law, which states whenever a monochromatic light passes through an absorbing medium, this is an absorbing medium, and this yellow color is the monochromatic light that is coming in, the intensity of the light reduces exponentially as the concentration of the absorbing medium increases. So if suppose that this is the absorbing medium, the light that is coming in, there is hemoglobin here, and if it is oxyhemoglobin or deoxyhemoglobin, it is going to differentially absorb this light, and what goes out will be a light with a lower intensity. So if you know what is the intensity at its entry and intensity at its exit, you can tell what is the concentration of the substance here. So we know that light at a wavelength of 660 nanometers, this is visible red light, 660 nanometers will be absorbed very effectively by deoxyhemoglobin, this blue line. 940 nanometers, that is infrared light, will be very effectively be absorbing oxyhemoglobin, that is red line. So if I inject, if I pass a combination of a red light at 660 and infrared light at 940 and find out what is the differential absorption, I can tell exactly what is the amount of deoxyhemoglobin and what is the amount of oxyhemoglobin, and thereby I can tell what is the percentage saturation. So now oxygen carrying capacity is hemoglobin into 10 into 1.36. Oxygen carrying capacity multiplied by the saturation that we got by that co-oximeter is the oxygen content. But small amount of oxygen may be dissolved in the plasma also. So 0.03 ml per millimeters of mercury of PO2 per liter. So this is the total oxygen content. Let us give the previous method of assessing. What I showed you now, co-oximeter, is the present method, the current method of analysis of percentage saturation. Previously, what used to be done was a blood gas derived analysis. So what is a blood gas? This is the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. We know that the oxygen will keep on be given off from the descending limb, and the ABG machine will find out what is the PO2. And from the PO2, we will derive what is the saturation. So the previous machines were calibrating saturation from PO2 based on oxygen dissociation curve. But the current machines that are used in the last 10 years or so are purely co-oximeter principle based on what I showed earlier. This Beer-Lambert law, and this is the principle currently in every cardiac catheterization laboratory. It's not based on arterial blood gas analysis, which was practiced till about 10 years ago. So now, again a recap, oxygen content is oxygen bound to hemoglobin plus dissolved oxygen. We have taken this dissolved oxygen also into consideration. So now, let us take an example, a sample of an arterial blood and a sample of a venous blood. A sample of an arterial blood, saturation into hemoglobin into 1.36 into 10. So 1 into 14 into 1.36 into 10. This is approximately 198 or roughly around 200. So arterial blood gas carries 200 ml of oxygen per liter. If you take the venous, it is 0.75 into the same numbers. So 149 plus 150. So venous blood will carry roughly about 150 ml of oxygen per liter. So this is what is called oxygen content. The two factors that determine the amount of oxygen consumed is, one is the cardiac output and second is the arteriovenous oxygen difference, which is also called as extraction. So let us see what is extraction. I just now told you arterial blood that is fully saturated carries 200 ml. Let's assume that the arterial blood is only 95% saturated. So it is 190 ml. When it returns back to the veins after giving the oxygen, it is 75% saturated or it is 150 ml. So what is the difference here? 190 minus 150, or in other words, 40 ml of oxygen is extracted in one go. So when from the artery the blood starts and goes back into the vein, the blood has extracted 40 ml. What is called extraction reserve is the amount to which this extraction can be increased. So in normal human beings, the extraction can be increased up to 3 times. That means 40 ml can be made 120 ml. So when the extraction goes to 120 ml per liter, the venous saturation will be as low as 35%. Venous saturation cannot go down less than 35% because by then our extraction reserve is exhausted. And thereafter there will be severe acidosis and the patient will not be alive. So the lowest permissible oxygen venous saturations will be around 35 and less than 35 will not be permissible with human life. So the extraction reserve is like 40 ml can be increased to 120 ml, or in other words, 3-fold is the extraction reserve. This is very important to understand one concept. The resting cardiac output and the resting oxygen saturation. What we calculate in the cath lab is the resting cardiac output and the resting oxygen extraction. VO2 is equal to cardiac index into arteriovenous extraction. We have now told that extraction reserve is 3-fold. So whenever I try to exercise, I can increase my extraction up to a maximum of 3-fold. So 40 can become 120. So extraction reserve is 3-fold. Now we have to see what is the cardiac index reserve also. That is called cardiac reserve. Cardiac reserve can be calculated as stroke volume into heart rate. So stroke volume reserve and heart rate reserve. Our normal stroke volume is anywhere around 70 ml and the maximum the stroke volume can increase is 110 to 140 ml. And so stroke volume reserve is 1.7 to 2-fold increase. What is the heart rate reserve? Our normal heart rate is somewhere around 60 to 70 and it can go up to 3 to 3.2 times, which means our heart rate can go up to 200 to 210 maximum. And so 3 to 3.2 is our heart rate reserve. So multiply stroke volume into heart rate, that is the cardiac index reserve, or in other words, cardiac reserve. Cardiac reserve is 6-fold. So now cardiac index into arteriovenous oxygen extraction is VO2. So cardiac reserve of 6 into extraction reserve of 3, 18-fold is the VO2 reserve, or in other words, oxygen consumption reserve. Why we are talking about all these numbers now? This is the utility. At a normal condition, when we are having a cardiac index which is about 3 liters, we will be taking an arteriovenous oxygen extraction of only about 40 ml. But when we begin to exercise, slowly we will start extracting more and more and more. So the arteriovenous difference will keep increasing from 40 to 120 here. At the same time, the cardiac index will keep on increasing from 3 to 18, that is 6-fold increase. So put together, there is an 18-fold increase that we can achieve by maximum exercise on our volume of oxygen consumption. So the normal oxygen consumption is 3.5 ml per kg per minute, which is 1 metabolic equivalent. And our oxygen consumption reserve is 18-fold. That means 18 METs. The maximum ability to improve the oxygen consumption by an usual human being is something like 18 METs. From 1 MET, I can increase it to 18 MET. This for a cardiology postgraduate to understand. When you start walking on a Bruce protocol at 1.7 miles per hour at 10-degree grade, you at the end of 1 minute, you will come to an extraction of close to 5 METs. And you go to the highest level of around 7th stage, when the speed is 6 miles per hour and the grade is 22 degrees angulation, you reach about 19 or 18 or 19 METs. This is the normal maximum amount that is achieved by a very healthy human being. Now you are able to understand what is volume of oxygen consumption reserve, and up to 18-fold you will be able to increase your oxygen consumption. So obviously in heart failure, the oxygen consumptions will, the cardiac index will keep going down. So this will cause the patient to extract more and more. And in athlete, the cardiac index will go higher and higher. And so he will be consuming less amount of oxygen. Now, having seen what is oxygen extraction, now how do we actually measure it? We sample at various places. Sample in a patient who is having no shunt at all, the mixed venous sample is ideally taken from pulmonary artery. Arterial sample can be taken from any artery. So the artery minus pulmonary artery is the cardiac output. The measurement is currently done only on reflectance oximetry or optical absorptions oximetry, and not based on extrapolation from ABG, which was used in the past. Some of the errors in oximetry is plastic syringe will diffuse oxygen. Too much of dilution with heparinized saline will dilute. If you introduce an air bubble, it will increase the PO2 and reduce the PCO2. If there is a time delay, you take the blood now and send to the lab 1 hour later, there is going to be some error. So these are the basic errors of oximetry. Some common pitfalls: inappropriate and inaccurate mixed venous saturation. If you are not taking the samples in quick succession, then there is going to be problem. PA wedge sample is taken instead of PA. PA wedge will be much more higher, so that will introduce error. IVC, if it is taken very close to the hepatic vein, it may be low if the patient is postprandial. It may be high if the patient is preprandial. It will always be very high if it is near a renal vein. Similarly, superior vena cava can be artificially be high in a patient with ASD or VSD with severe tricuspid regurgitation. So in that patients, you have to take it at high SVC. Sedation-induced hypoventilation can induce errors. Inappropriate pulmonary vein assumptions can induce errors. And dissolved oxygen is often ignored in many patients, and that will be important whenever a patient is on oxygen. So the errors in oxygen consumption is somewhere around 6%, and errors in arteriovenous oxygen difference is somewhere around 5%. So there will be some amount of error in FIC oxygen method to a tune of about 10%, but by and large it is reasonably accurate. Whenever there is a small arteriovenous oxygen difference, there will be more errors. So in high cardiac output, the difference between the artery and vein will be very small, and so you will have more errors. Some of the alternatives for Fick oxygen principle is dye dilution and thermodilution. Dye dilution uses the principle of assessing the concentration of the dye over a period of time. So you are injecting here for some time from the cubital vein to the radial artery, there is no concentration at all. Then it suddenly starts increasing, it goes to a peak, it comes back and starts to recirculate. You extrapolate this descending curve to the baseline and find out what is the area under the curve. This is the area under the curve is the denominator. The concentration into time is the denominator. I is the amount of injectate and the cardiac output. All these things we need not manually do it. It's machine done. So it goes by the principle of Stewart-Hamilton equation, where cardiac output is the amount of injectate divided by concentration into time. Thermodilution was introduced in the 1950s. It's basically like a dye dilution. The only difference is instead of dye, it is the temperature. So the cold injectate, when you are injecting, suddenly the temperature goes down and becomes normal. And this temperature change, this is the concentration of cold, and the same area under the curve is calculated, and thermodilution uses the same principle. Here, if you calculate, in high cardiac output, there will be a rapid change in the temperature and a rapid normalization of the temperature. In low cardiac output, there will be a slow reduction in the temperature and a slow normalization of the temperature. So the method in which a thermodilution is being done is with an assumption that the patient has absolutely no shunt at all and has no significant tricuspid regurgitation. There are separate catheters for children and for adult. You have to inject through the proximal port saline, which goes in the superior vena cava, and you have to sense it in the pulmonary artery. The distance between superior vena cava and pulmonary artery is meant to be 15 centimeter in a child of less than 15 kilogram and 29 centimeter in a child of more than 15 kilogram, because these are the two thermodilution catheters. The first value is ignored because it cools the catheter shaft, and then 3 runs are taken and they are averaged. If the values are far apart from each other, you keep on repeating till you get concordant value. Room temperature saline is preferred rather than iced saline because iced saline may induce hypothermia and arrhythmia. And it has been shown that even room temperature is sufficiently good enough. In cath lab, the normal room temperature is around 21 to 25 degree, which is significantly lower than the patient temperature of 37 degree. The fallacies are, whenever the high cardiac output, the temperature change is quite minimal. If the PA tip is close to the wall acts as a sink and there is less of cooling. If the proximal port is not in free flowing blood, that means the proximal port is within the sheath, the injection may not reach quickly the body. Respiration may induce a small change in the temperature, because when you are breathing in the air at 21 degree in the cath lab, and that is going to cool the blood. Slow injection will have a small temperature drop, and so the injection needs to be at a constant fast method. Volume of injection cannot be wrong. So if you are supposed to inject 5 ml, you have to inject 5 ml. And if you inject 4.5 ml, it will be wrong. The computer data can be wrong. You can enter wrong volume and you can enter wrong French, and the whole machine will, basically you have to feed whether it is a 5 French catheter or a 7 French catheter. Otherwise the machine will make errors. So the concept, the thermodilution base is based on a formula which depends on the amount of volume that you are injecting, the temperature of the blood and the temperature of the injectate, the specific gravity, the specific heat, and the change in the temperature. That delta TB dt is the change in the temperature. Other methods for cardiac assessment, cardiac output assessment are MRI, endotracheal aortic impedance, pulse pressure from the finger probe, which is called FinaPress, flow track, which is from the radial artery catheter, and assessing the pulse pressure of the radial artery pressure curve. These are various methods that are followed. Among all these methods, Fick oxygen principle is the most scientifically sound method. Maximum advantage in shunts because other methods fail in shunts. There are fallacies in all the methods, but we understand the fallacies in Fick oxygen principle far better than the other methods. And fallacies are clearly understood in Fick's principle compared to any other method that you practice. The shunt detection is by finding out what is the mixed venous saturation. Right atrium receives blood from superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus. Coronary sinus will have a high extraction, so low in oxygen saturation. IVC will have a low renal extraction, so it will be high in its saturation. So majority of the children, they will be using only superior vena cava. However, we need to understand in an adult, only 30% of blood comes from the superior vena cava, and if you don't factor in the inferior vena cava, it may not be correct. So FLAM formula uses 3 SVC plus 1 IVC by 4. We have to understand this formula very clearly. If you are deeply sedating a child, the child will have a very high SVC saturation because cerebral metabolism will be low. If you are having a child who is postprandial, the intestinal metabolism will be high, and so the IVC saturation will be low. If you are doing an exercise study in the cath lab with a bicycle ergometry, the leg saturation will be low, and so more weightage has to be given for inferior vena cava. So even this FLAM equation, you need to understand it based on what is the relative absorption of oxygen in different parts of the body. Coming to calculations, QP uses PA and PV saturation. So QP is equal to oxygen consumption divided by pulmonary vein oxygen content versus pulmonary artery oxygen content. Systemic blood flow, QS, is oxygen consumption divided by aortic oxygen content minus mixed venous oxygen content. Effective pulmonary blood flow is the blood flow that would be present if there is absolutely no shunt at all. So that means pulmonary vein oxygen content minus mixed venous oxygen content. Ideally speaking, the entire mixed venous blood should go into the lungs and come out through the pulmonary vein. So QEP is pulmonary vein minus mixed venous oxygen content. So left to right shunt lesion means QP minus QEP. QEP is the actual amount of venous blood that is entering. QP is the total amount of blood that is entering, which includes the shunt also. So left to right shunt is QP minus QEP. QP by QS ratio is a preferred method because there is a volume of oxygen consumption assumption in this formula, and once you divide QP by QS, that assumption is gone, and so here there is less of assumption regarding volume of oxygen consumption. The left-right shunt, whenever it is happening to anything more than 7% step up, is going to be significant. This is Dexter's equation, which states that at an atrial level more than 7% is significant, and at a ventricular level more than 5% is significant, and arterial level it is more than 5%. In fact, during the period of Dexter, it was not based on percentage saturation, it was based on oxygen content. But now, in order to simplify this, it has been made into percentage saturation. So which means up to 7% there can be errors, and if it is clearly more than 7%, it is significant left-right shunt. So we have to remember when we are taking the sample that we need to have a steady state. That means the patient should not be agitated and should not have too much of dynamic differences between first sample and second sample. There should be a rapid collection of sample. It should not be like first sample is collected and 10 minutes later second sample. We should remember that the oximetry is insensitive to very, very small shunts, and it is highly flow dependent. So whenever there is a high flow, the shunt gets exaggerated. For example, if there is an extremely high flow, the shunt will be, the pulmonary vein may be 98 and the pulmonary artery may be 95. So the difference between pulmonary vein and pulmonary artery is only 3%. So the shunt gets exaggerated and you will get values like 7:1 shunt, 8:1 shunt and all, which are not correct because it is flow dependent. The shunt gets exaggerated whenever it is a very high flow. Now coming to the left side, the arterial desaturation. Any arterial desaturation less than 95%, there can be two reasons. One is it is alveolar hypoventilation, which is called physiological shunt, which means the pulmonary vein itself is low. It can be due to sedation, it can be due to pulmonary disease, or it can be due to pulmonary congestion, as in a large VSD or large PDA, or a patient who is having mitral stenosis or left ventricular failure. Anatomical shunt is what is truly happening from right to left, like an ASD right to left shunt, VSD right to left shunt. So this we need to differentiate between these two. And in order to differentiate between these two, we need to go into the pulmonary vein and record the pulmonary venous saturation in order to find out what is the difference between pulmonary vein to arterial saturation. Similarly, if you are having unexpectedly high PA saturation of more than 80%, this means it's always due to a left right shunt. So we'll finalize it now. The QP is equal to the amount of blood in the pulmonary circulation. QS is equal to the amount of blood that goes in the systemic circulation. QEP is the effective pulmonary blood flow. That is the amount of blood that goes in the pulmonary circulation, assuming that there is absolutely no shunt at all. Left right shunt in a patient who is having a pure left right shunt is QP minus QS. But in a patient who is having bidirectional shunt, it is QP minus QEP. Right to left shunt is QS minus QP in pure right to left shunt. For example, a pulmonary arteriovenous fistula, QS minus QP is right to left shunt. In patients who are having bidirectional shunt, for example, like truncus arteriosus, for example, like single ventricle, right to left shunt is QS minus QEP. So remember these numbers, remember these formulas. So there are 4 numbers that we want to understand: QP, QS, QEP, and QES. QES, effective systemic blood flow, is equal to QEP. Both are the same. So what we need will be 4 samples: mixed venous sample, PA sample, PV sample, and aortic sample. We will go into each one of them now. Mixed venous sample, we can use FLAM formula by taking SVC and IVC, or use only superior vena cava if it is a small child. In patients with no shunt at all, mixed venous saturation, PA is the ideal place. If PA saturation is less than mixed venous saturation, take PA as the mixed venous. This is very important. If, for example, if you are taking superior vena cava 70, inferior vena cava 75, but you enter into the PA and PA is only 68, don't calculate based on SVC and IVC. PA, if the PA is lower, then the lowest value is the mixed venous. There is no step down in the right heart. Remember, there is no step down in the right heart. For example, in an ASD shunt calculation, if the SVC is 70 and IVC is 75 and PA is 69, take 69 for calculations. Don't take 70 and 75. This you should always remember. There is no step down in right heart. Similarly, there is no step up in left heart. In pulmonary vein to aorta, there is no step up. There cannot be a step up. PA saturation, ideally taken beyond the level of hilar vessels in order to allow a good mixture. So in shunts at arterial level, mixture may be incomplete. So RPA and LPA are taken separately. Avoid wedge sample. When I tell you go beyond the hilum, it should not be a wedge also. Left-right shunt through a bronchopulmonary collateral will be at pre-arteriolar level and cannot be quantified well at all. PV. Assumptions in PV saturation is a common cause of error, and we cannot differentiate between anatomical right to left shunt and physiological right to left shunt if we don't take PV saturation at all. Physiological shunt is basically due to lung hypoventilation or lung pathology where the PV is also desaturated. Anatomical right to left shunt is pure right to left shunt at atrial, ventricular, or arterial level. The difference can only be identified by sampling the PV. So you have to sample the PV. Choose the PV which has got normal radiological visible lung parenchyma. So if suppose the right lung is very clearly seen, take from the right lung the PV which is looking reasonably normal. There is no step up in the left heart. So always take the highest value as PV. For example, descending aorta is 97, but pulmonary vein is 94. Take PV also as 97 for calculation. There is no step up in the left heart at all. Aortic saturation can be sampled at any artery except in ductal reversal, where you have to calculate separately the ascending aorta and descending aortic sample. The time interval between PV and aorta should be kept very less to differentiate between anatomical and physiological left-right shunts. Vascular resistance is calculated by aortic mean pressure minus RA mean pressure divided by systemic blood flow is systemic vascular resistance. On an average, it is between 10 to 20 Wood units indexed. Pulmonary vascular resistance is PA mean pressure minus LA mean pressure or PV mean pressure divided by QP. And on an average, it is about 1 Wood unit. The average ratio between PVR to SVR is roughly 0.1 or 10%. So systemic vascular resistance is commonly 10 to 20. Pulmonary vascular resistance is up to maximum of 2. How to avoid the fallacies? If you, instead of calculating separately QP and QS, and you calculate QP by QS ratio, you take away the errors of oxygen consumption. Similarly, if you calculate the PVR by SVR ratio, you are taking away the oxygen consumption errors. But unfortunately, absolute PVRI is still given significance. Diagnostic criteria for PAH is absolute PVRI more than 3 Wood units. Inoperability criteria for shunt lesion is absolute PVRI more than 8 Wood units. Positive vasodilator response testing, absolute PVRI less than 15 Wood units. So even though we would say QP by QS is better, PVR by SVR is better, many guidelines still specify absolute PVRI, and so we need to understand that oxygen consumption should be taken into consideration for majority of calculations. Catheterization for operability, basically the principles that are used are, you look at the symptoms. If you are having symptoms, they are operable. You look at the age, younger age, they are operable. You look at the clinical findings, very hyperkinetic precardium, they are operable. Look at the chest X-ray, very large heart and plethora, they are operable. Look at the ECG, an appropriate chamber, left atrium and left ventricle are dilated in a VSD, they are operable. Echocardiogram, look at the volume overload. LA and LV are dilated in VSD, they are operable. Pulse oximeter saturation, no desaturation. And oxygen saturation on any sort of provocation, whether it is exercise, no desaturation. This is generally considered operable. However, we need to understand fallacies. In history, a bronchopulmonary disease cannot be differentiated from symptoms of heart failure. Both will have the same breathing difficulty. Growth failure can be multifactorial. It may be syndromic. Lung infections are dependent on the innate immunity and contact with infective agents, and so frequent lung infections cannot be taken as an index of operability. Appropriate nutritional supplement can be making a patient, even with a large VSD, to have normal growth if the patient is from an affluent population. So all these are fallacies of history. Fallacies of age. Some of the young syndromic children can have very high PVR despite young age. Down syndrome at 6 months can have high PVR, and it does not mean younger age is operable. Maladaptation of pulmonary vasculature is seen in many IUGR syndromic babies. Prematurity facilitates very early fall of PVR, and so prematurity may cause a rapid fall in the PVR. Associated bronchopulmonary and airway diseases may alter PVR even in young age, and in such patients, even hypothyroidism, vitamin B1 deficiency, anemia, all these things may be influencing. So age alone, just younger age, immediately they are operable, this also cannot be taken as a golden rule. Fallacies of clinical examination. If you are having a child who is having a small airway disease with hyperinflated lungs, the apex may not be shifted down and out, and you may not be able to hear the flow murmurs. If there is a significant associated lung pathology, your clinical examination may be altered. For example, significant dextroposition caused by a lung pathology. Body build, whether it is asthenia or well built, they all will matter. If you are having an associated AV valve regurgitation or semilunar valve regurgitation, the heart may be very large, but the shunt may not be significant. Anemia can produce a very hyperkinetic chest, but the patient may not be operable. So fallacies are there in clinical examination also. Cardiomegaly on chest X-ray is dependent on ventricular myocardial function. If the myocardial function is low, a large VSD with Eisenmenger syndrome with associated dilated cardiomyopathy will have a large heart. Regurgitation of AV valves and semilunar valves will have a large heart. And if the lungs are hyperinflated, as in emphysema or asthma, the heart can be smaller. So plethora or peribronchial lung infiltrate due to a pneumonia or an infection cannot be differentiated clearly. So chest X-ray may have fallacies. ECG lags clinical findings. ECG findings persist longer than the clinical course. For example, if you are having a patient at 4 months or 6 months of age with a LV volume overload, but the child at 1 year the shunt becomes inoperable, Still, the LV volume overload pattern on the ECG may persist even after 6 months. So ECG finding may lag. It is less sensitive. Echocardiogram is based on chamber volumes. So the larger the LV, we say a PDA or VSD is operable. But we don't very often use a standardized value. So it is very difficult to assess what is a chamber volume. Similarly, as I told you earlier, myocardial function can alter the ventricular volume. Pulse oximetry at rest, it depends on what is called pulsatility index. If the peripheral perfusion is poor, the pulse oximetry may not detect very correctly, and a coexistent lung pathology or an airway obstruction can produce hypoxia. That does not mean the child is inoperable. Even though we use exercise oximetry, there is no standard that is given for what is an adequate exercise. And exercise testing is inapplicable for sick hospitalized bronchopneumonia patient who is having saturation of 85%. And it is influenced by the amount of FiO2 in very sick patients. So cardiac catheterization still will be needed because all the other conventional methods sometimes may prove to be difficult. So we need to assess what is called as, we need to achieve what is called a steady state in the cath lab, which means a very perfect equilibrium of a patient. So one of the method of assessing that will be to take the first blood gas, and preferably this first blood gas, if it shows the PCO2 of 35 to 45 and a pH of 7.4, that means the patient is reasonably in a steady state. But we need to remember that the carbon dioxide diffusion is 30 times more faster than the oxygen diffusion. And so hypoventilation initially will not show up on carbon dioxide. Early hypoventilation will only affect oxygen. And only when the hypoventilation goes beyond a point, then only PCO2s will start rising. If you are able to get into the pulmonary vein, if the pulmonary vein shows a PO2 more than 90 millimeters of mercury, that is the perfect indicator that the patient is having a reasonable adequacy of ventilation in room air. So in the beginning of your cath lab, if you are having the PCO2 of 40, pH of 7.4, and you enter into the pulmonary vein and the pulmonary vein samples show PO2 of more than 90, this patient is in perfect steady state, and quickly you can keep completing the entire study. In general, sampling sites are guided by prior knowledge of the lesion. Superior vena cava site in PAPVC or TAPVC has to be way high up, almost as high in the jugular veins. IVC sample has to be below the level of hepatic veins in the Scimitar syndrome. PA sample in a PDA has to be deep into the right hilum and left hilum. Aortic sample in a ducts with reversal has to be high in the ascending aorta and much lower in the descending aorta. PV sample has to be in a healthy lungs and not in a pathological lungs. Sometimes we use assumed values, sometimes we use measured values. What are the conditions where assumed values are more correct? I will give an example. Pulmonary AV malformation. You have a PA sample of 70%, and in the pulmonary vein which is connected to the pulmonary AV malformation, the PV is 80%. If you calculate the PV minus PA by 80% minus 70%, actual QP will be very, very high. So if you use these numbers in calculation, the QP is quite high, whereas in truth, QP is actually very low in pulmonary AV malformation. The QP is the amount of blood that goes through the pulmonary capillary bed and not through the AV malformation. So what happens? This is wrong. So in a patient where it is pulmonary AV malformation, we should assume 99% for PV in the calculation. So what does this mean? We are taking assumed value to be correct rather than the true measured value. This applies to post bidirectional Glenn. If you are doing a post Glenn cath, some of the pulmonary veins will have low saturation due to PAV malformations, and you need to take the PV with the highest saturation for the calculation. If you are taking the lower saturations, your QP will be falsely be high. When will you take when you will not take assumed value and when you will go for measured value. In some of the lesions, assumed values are incorrect and we should try to get measured values. In VSD or AP window with severe pulmonary hypertension, if you assume the PV as 99, this will indicate that the patient is having optimal ventilation and the patient is in a reasonably steady state. But whenever the aortic saturation is 94, you cannot just take 94 plus 1 as 95 and take that as the PV, because there may be a right left shunt. So in a patient of post-tricuspid shunt or a pre-tricuspid shunt where you are assessing the operability, you need to enter into the PV and record the PV. Here measured value is correct and not the assumed value. So sometimes you have to do even a septal puncture to enter into the pulmonary vein to take the measured value. If you take assumed value, it is wrong. So I gave example on when assumed value is correct. I gave example of when measured value is correct. One last factor on calculations, transpulmonary gradient and diastolic pulmonary gradient. Transpulmonary gradient is pulmonary artery mean minus pulmonary vein mean pressure. It's the key indicator of PVR. PVRI more than 3 Wood units is the diagnostic criteria for idiopathic PAH. Diastolic pulmonary gradient is PA diastolic pressure minus PV mean pressure or LA mean pressure. This is an direct indicator of precapillary spasm. In the absence of pulmonary regurgitation, the normal diastolic pulmonary gradient in a normal person is less than 3 millimeters of mercury, but more than 7 is significant elevation. We need to understand that pulmonary regurgitation can be created in the cath lab by rigid catheters, rigid guide wires, rigid sheets, and so falsely the PA diastolic pressure can fall down because of induced PR. Acute vasodilator testing is done in some of the shunt lesions. Nitric oxide is the commonly used vasodilator at 20 to 40 parts per million for 10 minutes. Sometimes you can even go to 80 parts per million immediately to get a maximal response because you are going to give it only for 10 minutes and finish the study. It's practically difficult to avoid oxygen when you are giving nitric oxide because this is given as a combination. And so oxygen cannot be avoided. You have to take the dissolved oxygen into calculation. Oxygen narrows the PV to PA difference, and so it often overestimates the QP in majority of the shunts. The criteria that is used in shunts are, take only the last blue line, 20% fall in PVR or 20% fall in PVR SVR ratio or absolute PVRI less than 6 or PVR by SVR absolute value less than 0.3. Or the last value is PA diastolic pressure to aortic diastolic pressure less than 0.4. I'll come to some examples. What agent is preferred? Nitric oxide is the preferred agent. Nebulized iloprost is another option, or inhaled treprostinil puffs by a metered dose inhaler is another option. This will simplify the procedure in the cath lab if you have an access to nebulized iloprost as well as metered dose inhaler of treprostinil, but by and large, these are not available in many of the Indian centers. In some special situations, you can give ipoprostenol or iloprost infusions, and in children, adenosine is not recommended for shunt calculations. Some of the advanced tests that are being done are pulmonary endothelial function assessment by giving acetylcholine in a small segment of the pulmonary artery and finding out the pressures with a flow wire, and checking the pressures and finding out the circulating endothelial progenitor cells, but these are of research value. Now coming to individual lesions, we will try to finish within the next 15 to 20 minutes, first starting with pre-tricuspid shunt lesions. In a pre-tricuspid shunt lesions, there are some special situations that I have listed below where cath may be needed. The first situation, infancy. Early presentation in ASD. Usually secondum ASD does not present in early infancy at all. These children are relatively asymptomatic. If you are having an ASD with heart failure, that means the patient is having either a primum ASD with associated mitral valve anomaly like left anterior mitral leaflet where the shunt can be larger. But we need to understand about 5 to 6% of ASD in infancy can have premature heart failure with hyperkinetic PAH. These are generally aggravated by borderline left ventricular hypoplasia. In order to understand this early presentation, let us see the pressure volume loop of left and right ventricle in the fetus. In the fetus, both the left and right ventricle are operating at the same pressure. The volumes are relatively the same because each ventricle is symmetric. So this is the systolic phase and this is the diastolic phase. Now, what happens immediately after birth? There is an acute increase in the systemic vascular resistance. So the left ventricular pressure increases. And whenever the left ventricular pressure increases, the increase in the afterload reduces its contractility. So the LV pressure volume curve changes like this. RV, what happens? There is a fall in the pulmonary artery pressure and fall in the pulmonary vascular resistance. So the pressures fall down, and so the RV pressure volume curve becomes like this. This is in the immediate postnatal period. Now, remember this picture. In immediate postnatal to later childhood, what happens? Right ventricular mass keeps on regressing, thereby increasing the amount of left-right shunt in an ASD. So slowly the curve shifts towards the right. The right ventricle curve shifts towards the right, and it operates on a much larger volume. The larger volume because this RV is now volume overloaded. Now, this transition from this phase to this phase is happening because of various changes that happen in the myocardium, like regression of the RV mass, and various changes that happen in the pulmonary arteriolar bed. So in some of the prematurely presenting infant, a large shunt is established too early, which results in inadequate regression of the PA musculature. So pulmonary arterial hypertension occurs. The right ventricle goes into failure, RV EDP increases, RA pressure increases, and these patients present with congestive heart failure. So some of the small children can present with significantly higher PA pressures and heart failure. The second is conventional patient, which we see in day-to-day practice, where an older patient is coming with ASD and pulmonary hypertension. ASD with pulmonary hypertension is seen in about 5 to 6% of all the patients with secondary ASD. There are two different groups of patients. In one group of patients, there is a progressive RV volume overload that causes pulmonary vascular disease. In these patients, the ASD is often more than 2 centimeters, and they often present beyond 4th decade. But some of them are genetically predisposed. So this is basically an idiopathic PAH along with a bystander ASD. Here, often the ASD is less than 2 centimeters, and these patients are maybe younger. PAH operability, whenever the PA pressure is more than 60 millimeters of mercury, it's a warning bell and you need to do a cardiac catheterization. And in catheterization, if you get a QP by QS of more than 1.5 with an indexed PVR less than 6 Wood units, these patients are operable. In addition to resting state, in addition to these two criteria, more than 1.5 shunt and less than 6 Wood units, there should not be a step down from PV to aorta, and PVR by SVR ratio should be less than 0.3. Role of balloon occlusion in ASD is not very well documented in literature, unlike in PDAs, but you need to understand in ASD also the PA pressure will fall. This is an example of a balloon occlusion that we do in a patient who is having a moderate hypertension in a ASD. So the PA systolic pressure from 60 keeps going down to almost around 25 on a balloon occlusion. And when you are deflating the balloon, it slowly again comes back. So even though balloon occlusion test in ASD is not validated, you will find in the cath lab that balloon occlusion will also show a fall if the patient is operable. In patients with PAH, acute vasodilator testing is done, and if the diastolic pulmonary gradient is less than 12 millimeters of mercury, they are likely to do well. But if the diastolic pulmonary gradient is more than 12, they are unlikely to do well. Some of the methods of treating them will be fenestrated ASD patch or fenestrated devices. There are also talks about what is called treat and close. That means give pulmonary vasodilators and then close. or sometimes called as close and treat. That means do the closure and then continue to treatment. All these things should be taken after very careful clinical judgment. Whenever there is desaturation in an ASD, that's a point of concern. Desaturation can be due to unroofed coronary sinus, tricuspid regurgitation jet hitting the ASD, IVC straddling an inferiorly malaligned ASD, superior vena cava straddling a superiorly malaligned SVC ASD, or Eustachian valve directing the blood from the right inferior vena cava towards the left atrium. So we need to understand desaturation and identify whether any of these anatomical reasons may be present. Otherwise, it is due to pulmonary hypertension and pulmonary vascular resistance. Normally more than 1.5:1 shunt is closed, but sometimes you will close shunts even in less than 1.5:1. For example, after balloon pulmonary valvotomy for a critical pulmonary stenosis or pulmonary atresia intact ventricular septum, when these patients grow bigger and bigger, they will have a borderline hypoplasia of the right ventricle, and their QP by QS may not be very large, they will be less than 1.5. But they are a source of paradoxical embolism and paradoxical strokes. So sometimes you will go and close those ASDs. ASDs in hypoplastic RV and hypoplastic tricuspid valve, which are predisposing to a right to left shunt, sometimes may be closed. ASD in Epstein's anomaly, where there is a very, very minimal tricuspid regurgitation, but again exposing them to paradoxical embolism. ASD with orthodeoxyplatypnia syndrome, or ASD in carcinoid syndromes. A carcinoid syndrome with a small ASD can cause pathological neurotransmitters from the intestine and liver to cross into the left side and affect the mitral valve and aortic valve. Similarly, ASD is closed, even if it is small, in patients on left ventricular assist device. If you are sucking the blood from the left ventricle and if you are keeping an ASD open, the blood will shunt from the right atrium to the left atrium and you need to close the ASD. So there will be sometimes an indication for closing the ASD even when the ASD is less than 1.5. Dependent versus obligatory shunt. A dependent shunt is a pre-tricuspid shunt like an ASD, which depends on SVR PVR ratio, which depends on the ventricular function, ventricular EDP, and ventricular compliance. This may keep increasing or reducing with the age of the patient. Whereas obligatory shunt is one that is seen in conditions like isolated PAPVC. The shunt is completely left-right. It will never become right-left. And the shunt is less dependent on ventricular function, EDP compliance. Shunt will remain constant with age. Dependent shunt will vary with age, whereas shunt will remain constant with age. So this is the difference between dependent and obligatory. Obligatory shunt example is PAPVC. Dependent shunt example is ASD. One of the peculiarity of a pre-tricuspid shunt is pre-tricuspid shunt can go suprasystemic, whereas BSD and PDA can never go suprasystemic. Coming to post-tricuspid shunts, a fetal PVR when it falls, shunt gets established. We call QP by QS as 1:1, 1.5:1, 2:1, 3:1. We need to understand what does this number mean. Carefully look at this number. A QP by QS of 2:1 means 50% of the left ventricle blood is pumped through the VSD. In order to make you understand this slide better, I'll draw a cartoon. Just look at only this slide. If you are having 3 liters of blood that is coming back into the tricuspid valve from the right atrium, and the same 3 liters goes into the lungs, but additional 3 liters gets added from the VSD, a total of 6 liters goes in the pulmonary artery. And so QP is 6 liters, QP is 3 liters. So QP by QS is 2:1. If you carefully look at what is the amount of blood from the left ventricle that has crossed over, 50% of blood has crossed over. So if the left ventricle is pumping 50% of this blood, it is QP by QS of 2:1. If the left ventricle is shunting only 25%, that is QP by QS of 1.33:1. And if it shunts 75% of the blood, QP by QS is 4:1. So remember, more than 75% the blood cannot be shunted. Then there will not be anything that is effectively going into the aorta. So QP by QS values more than 4:1 is unphysiological. It cannot happen in real life. And so the numbers, if you are getting QP by QS of 6:1, 7:1, it is due to the fallacy in the methods of our calculation rather than truly in the body, 6 times the blood going into the lungs. It cannot happen in human body. Oximetry in VSDs and PDAs, SVC saturation should be recorded well above the right atrium to avoid streaming caused by PFO or tricuspid regurgitation. Always try to take a PV sample, because only by taking a PV sample you will be able to differentiate a right to left shunt. Simultaneous PV and aortic sampling is the best way to assess right to left shunt. And PA sample should be as far in the hilum as possible, especially in a PDA. The classical pressure trace of a VSD will be similar. PA and aorta will be similar if it is a very large VSD or a very large PDA, because the pressures are equalized. Now, so what we need to calculate, what we need to carefully see is what is the diastolic pulmonary gradient. Look at the PA diastole, look at what is the PV mean, and see what is the diastolic pulmonary gradient. If the diastolic pulmonary gradient is quite a lot, that means there is a good amount of precapillary arteriolar spasm. I told initially that the PA diastolic to aortic diastolic ratio of less than 0.4 is considered operable. In a very large VSD, it almost will never happen because PA diastolic will be high. There will be some amount of pre-arteriolar capillary spasm. In such a patient, if you give pulmonary vasodilator, the PA diastolic will go low, and in this point you can apply what is the PA diastolic to aortic diastolic ratio. It is applicable in VSD patients. If a PA diastolic to aortic diastolic is less than 0.4, they are considered operable. Whereas in PDA, last time also I mentioned, there will always be in a large PDA diastolic equalization. So you will not be able to identify a diastolic separation in a large PDA. So how you will assess in a large PDA an operability will be the whole aortic pressure and PA pressure, the diastolic pressure will go to very low levels. So you will find that the PA diastolic goes to 30 millimeters of mercury or 25 millimeters of mercury if it is significantly operable. There are also a question about what are the different times at which each patient will present with Eisenmenger syndrome. In AP window and PDA, since the pulmonary artery faces the systemic pressure throughout systole and diastole, there is more amount of endothelial damage, and so they present with Eisenmenger much earlier. In VSD, it's only during systole that they face, so they present a little later in third decade. In ASD, there is a very slow progressive onset, so they present in fourth or fifth decade. Between AP window and PDA, PDA is a long tube that offers resistance, and so they present a little later. Whereas AP window has no resistance at all. It's a window. There is no length to the tube, so they present very early. We need to understand when we are calculating the PVR in these patients that there can be various confounders like airway obstruction, bronchopneumonia, anemia, polycythemia, hypothyroidism, vitamin B1 deficiency, or beriberi and chronic lung pathologies. The rule in operability is there should not be any clinical desaturation at all. And if there is a desaturation, there should be an explainable lung disease. Exercise desaturation should not be present unless there is a lung disease. So this should be the basic rule. AV canal is a special situation where they are commonly associated with Down syndrome. So in Down syndrome, frequent respiratory tract infections are very common. Pulmonary vascular tree is poorly developed. The high pressures from the VSD will induce more damage on the small pulmonary vasculature. Airway is very hypoplastic. Many of them will have obstructive sleep apnea. So Down syndrome very easily predisposes to pulmonary vascular disease. Whenever you are catheterizing a Down syndrome, you should sample the PV and simultaneously the aorta, and this will exclude an anatomical right to left shunt. These patients get sedated too much during the catheterization, and so hypoventilation is very common, and you can identify it properly by doing a PV sampling. We have to take some precautions on these Down syndrome children. We have to optimally sedate them, don't over sedate them. First blood gas should show a PCO2 of 40 and pH of around 7.4. And if the first PV sample shows a PO2 of more than 90, that means this patient is adequately sedated. Then you can go ahead. If these numbers are not there, you wait till the child comes out slightly out of the effect of sedation. And in some rare cases, if the child is going into apnea, you may have to give mechanical ventilation. And if you are giving mechanical ventilation, give an FiO2 of 21 to 25%. Shunt with obstructive lesions are a special situation wherein combinations of mitral stenosis with VSD, combinations of coarctation with PDA may happen. Now, the peculiarity is a mitral stenosis or a coarctation will produce pulmonary venous hypertension. And this pulmonary venous hypertension will induce pulmonary arteriolar vasospasm, and that will lead to right eruption. So in such a patient, for example, this is a patient with a coarctation and a large PDA. In these patients, it is very difficult to assess whether they are operable or not. Like basically, if you are just going by a general dictum that everybody, whoever is having an obstructed lesion is operable, it may not be correct. Some of the patients who are relatively grown up, in small newborn with a large PD and severe coarctation, they may be operable. But in a grown up patient of 8 years, 10 years, who are having a combination of a large PDA with severe pulmonary hypertension along with coarctation, the coarctation may not, the pulmonary hypertension may not regress at all. So we need to remember, I am not going into multiple individual slides. We need to remember that whenever there is a combination of coarctation and PDA, in a small baby, it may be operable. But in a very, very significantly grown up patient with severe PAH and significant desaturation in the lower limb, it is very difficult to assess the operability. Another combination is mitral stenosis with ventricular septal defect, where a mitral stenosis can produce severe pulmonary arteriolar spasm due to PVH, and there can be some difficulties in assessing their condition. So we need to understand these patients will be a special category. Younger age, they are more operable. If the right to left shunt is negligible, they are operable. But if there is a profound cyanosis, like the cyanosis is like 60%, 50%, they are very less likely to be operable. And in general, more proximal the obstruction, they are operable. Like for example, mitral stenosis, more distal the obstruction, they are less operable, like coarctation of iron. So now these are going into very specific individual lesions. So what I will do is, I will skip these because these are largely applicable to a hardcore pediatric person. So now I will come to the last slides. The current applicability of all this oximetry and all will be to assess the patient for operability in patients who are presenting with significant pulmonary hypertension. The second indication will be in lots of univentricular heart prior to Glenn and Fontaine surgery. Oximetry runs, we need to understand that we need to take the basic samples of SVC, PV, PA, aorta, sometimes inferior vena cava also. In general, all the oximetry samples should be done quickly. We need to understand all these formulas like QP, QS, QEP, PVR, SVR, and we need to remember what is operable and what is non-operable. Thank you very much. Because it is exceeding the time, so I'm just cutting it short.
Thank you so much, sir, once again for that very, very clear and practical presentation, right from the technological things to the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. Sir, you have explained very, very beautifully. Once again, very, our heartfelt thanks to you, sir. Some questions that has come, sir. Now I will just ask them. Sir, do you routinely take multiple samples during the study, or those values that you mentioned, this 5 mm and 7%, it is only in a single run or it's a multiple run?
Yeah, basically long ago when Dexter laid down these criteria, that was purely dependent only on these repeated oximetry, because these were laid down, these criteria were laid down before the era of echocardiography. So in that, what they used to tell was, if you are using a single value, a value of more than 10% saturation step up will be of significance. And if you are doing multiple values, a value of more than 7% is significant. But today, it's very expensive to run multiple runs. In normal catheterization laboratory, if you are going to be assessing the shunt of an ASD or VSD, at the maximum, you will do one single run on basal study. And if there is pulmonary hypertension, maybe one run. It's every sample that we are taking is expensive. And so, for practical purposes, if there is more than 7% step up, that shunt is significant. And then you do the further calculations. What I wanted the postgraduate students to understand, when we are talking about basal 7% step up or 8% step up, remember, this 8% step up is very, very significant if it is at the higher numbers, and it is less significant if it is at the lower numbers. I'll give one example. Your mixed venous saturation is 60%, but it increases to 70% a step up. That means 10% step up. That shunt is less significant compared to another patient who is having a step up from 80% to 90%. The 80% to 90% is also the same 10%. But at a higher saturation, when you are having the same amount of step up, the QP will be enormously high. So while the general dictum is more than 7%, the step up, it is significant. If your numbers are at the lower levels, then it can be ignored. But if it is at the very high level, it needs to be given a lot of importance. This is very practical whenever you are in an operating room, when the surgeon is operating on a patient, and post-operatively, he has closed the VSD, closed the PDAs, and now before coming out of the operating room, he wants to do a final saturation check. So what they will do is right atrial and the pulmonary artery, 2 samples, and find out what is the step up. If that step up is more than, say, 7%, that means there is a significant residual VSD. If that step up is less than 7%, that means the residual ventricular septal defect is not of significance, and so the surgeon need not go back again. Now, your interpretation has to be like this. If the RA is increasing from 60 to 67, tell the surgeon it is okay, acceptable, come out. If the RA is going from 80 to 87, that means it is pathological. It means there is a large shunt. So you give more importance when it is at the higher levels.
Is there any particular sequence of taking the samples?
Yes.
Saturation for the saturations.
Correct. So it depends on what is the ease with which you will be able to enter the next chamber. Let's assume that a standard ventricular septal defect that you are going to be catheterizing. Sometimes SVC and IVC is immediately you will be able to access. But what will be more difficult may be pulmonary vein. The pulmonary vein, because sometimes you may not be able to find out a PFO, sometimes you may be puncturing them in those conditions. Then what you do is you enter into the most difficult chamber first. So you have entered the pulmonary vein and now you are sampling the pulmonary vein first. So now the moment you have sampled the pulmonary vein, immediately pull it back to IVC, push it up to SVC, enter into pulmonary artery. And while you are sampling the PV itself, your assistant is sampling the aorta. So all these 4 are in quick succession. If you anticipate that that particular patient is going to have an enormous difficulty in entering into one particular chamber, then go into that chamber first. Sometimes in extremely large ASDs who are having huge right atrium, huge tricuspid valve, severe tricuspid regurgitation, sometimes entry into pulmonary artery may be difficult. In that case, first you enter into pulmonary artery, then pull back into SVC, IVC, enter into PV and take the samples. So in the catheterization laboratory, the operator has to decide which is the most difficult chamber to enter, and he needs to enter that chamber and start the sampling from that chamber onwards.
Sir, anybody less than 3 years, sir, you routinely take it as 180, the cardiac oxygen consumption as
that can be one of the methods. Basically, I wanted to inform the principles behind this oxygen consumption, and so I went at length. one of the common opposition for using Lafarge formula in less than 3 years is that Lafarge did not use it on, did not check it on less than 3 years. So while this study was done in the 1960s and published in 1970, many studies that came from Europe, from Lundell, Bergstra, all of them came around the 80s that told a different formula for younger children. Now, the problem about younger children is whenever Lafarge formula was checked with the respiratory mass spectrometry, they identified that Lafarge formula was overestimating. But we understood that the principle of respiratory mass spectrometry itself will reduce, because of the ventilation, will reduce the oxygen consumption. So if we understand that a true respiratory mass spectrometry is going to cause a lower oxygen consumption, and Lafarge will give a slightly higher oxygen consumption, we can still use the Lafarge itself by the regression equations and try to make the calculations. And based on those calculations, then take the decisions. Or if you don't want a Lafarge, then you go by these fixed numbers, 180. Sometimes some people take 200. In my lab, I use by and large the same Lafarge regression equation and bring it down to less than 3 also. But there in certain situations where I don't have the graph, I don't have the curves, I don't have the chart, then sometimes I might use for a quick calculation 200 in a small infant. Let's assume a 6-month, 8-month-old infant, 200 I will take it.
Exercise induced desaturation. What is the criteria that I will not care that patient? If this criteria is fulfilled, I'm not going to care.
Yeah. So basically, the general rule that has been given is a saturation that is going down to less than 92% on exercise is an indicator. Is an indicator that the pulmonary vascular resistance is not falling with exercise, and so it is actually creating a right left shunt. But we need to understand pulse oximetry depends on variety of lung related and peripheral factors. Lung related factor is a patient who is having an associated coexistent any form of lung disease, whether it is a interstitial lung disease, whether it is a bronchopneumonia, whether it is a obstructive airway disease, they will have lower saturations. The second is peripheral factors. The peripheral perfusion, the peripheral pulsatility index, all may be abnormal. And so in such patients, all these exercise-induced pulse oximetry needs to be taken with a word of caution. It's an absolutely non-standardized assessment. And hence, taking a value just on exercise saturation, and if the patient is less than 92, in general, it tells that these patients are not easily operable candidates. And maybe you can offer them a proper conventional cardiac catheterization and assess their pulmonary vascular resistance. If you are in a sort of a screening manner where you want to choose only the correct good patients and leave behind all the borderline persons, then remove them from the list if your patient is having exercise. But we need to understand exercise-induced desaturation is dependent on variety of factors, not just anatomical right to left shunt caused by an elevation of the PVR. It can be due to pulmonary and peripheral factors. And most of the time, sicker the patient, the more will be the need for deciding the operability. And in those patients, they will not be able to exercise at all. And so while in a regular very healthy patient, exercise oxygen saturation may be possible. A patient who is sick with breathlessness, it will be very difficult to do a proper exercise. And also it is not standardized how much to exercise, what is the level to which you should go for an exercise, and whether it is, and very often another problem that you will understand will be exercise will be followed by a desaturation about 1 minute later. Basically the systemic vascular resistance will significantly fall during the exercise. It will remain low for a long period of time. So about a minute later, it will start falling down. And about 4 to 5 minutes, it will again climb back. And if you are, unless you are very carefully noting down the lowest nadir point, you will not be able to assess the exercise-induced oxygen saturation. While we all practice an exercise saturation of less than 92% as usually inoperable, we need to understand the fallacies of each and every method before deciding on one particular method and taking a decision.
Role of IV sildenafil in vascularity testing.
Yeah, that is also another newer method that has been used. As I told, Most of the pulmonary vasodilator testing has been done with nitric oxide, and the newer agents that are being tried as nebulized iloprost or metered dose inhaler of treprostinil, or intravenous sildenafil or IV iloprost. All these things are done in isolated single studies, and they have validated in a small number of patients against another agent like nitric oxide. So that is one method that you can follow, but it is not a very standardized technique. In general, what is being told is, in an adult, intravenous sildenafil 10 milligram over 10 minutes infusion, and then wait for about 10 minutes and take the pressures. It is, especially in cases like idiopathic pulmonary hypertension and all, it's not fully standardized. If you are doing it for operability testing in a shunt lesion, it is better to go with nitric oxide. If nitric oxide is not available, simple oxygen. All the other agents are completely not standardized to give a very reproducible value. We have tested in our laboratory nitric oxide versus ipoprostenol versus IV treprostinil. We don't have metered dose treprostinil. We also don't have inhaled iloprost. But I have tested IV treprostinil, IV ipoprostenol, and the nitric oxide. You sort of get varying results. Treprostinil, IV treprostinil produces profound fall in the systemic blood pressures sometimes. So sometimes the same thing will happen with IV sildenafil also. You may get sometimes a significant fall, systemic hypotension may happen. So it's not a very standardized method. But having said that, it is also one of the methods. In fact, if you go into the literature, there are people who have given IV nitroglycerin and IV milrinone in order to check the vasodilator response testing also. So these are also other agents. But most standardized is nitric oxide.
What is the role of 100% oxygen, and what is the method of administering 100%?
Yeah, basically I would say it as high flow oxygen. So if you are going to be giving it with a like a face mask, and if you blow oxygen at a very high speed, the current oxygen flow meters do not permit an oxygen flow of anything beyond 15 liters. So if you go to the maximum permissible value of around 10 to 15 liters, and if you blow through a face mask, in general, the FiO2 will go up to almost around 60 to 70%. And if you are using nasal prongs, in nasal prongs, you can go to a maximum of around 2 liters. Beyond 2 liters, then it will start drying up the nasal mucosa. So at around 2 liters, again, you will be able to drive the FiO2 to a maximum level of around 70 FiO2. So this is what is the maximal permissible level of oxygen that you can increase if you are giving in a conscious patient. If you have to increase it further, the only other methods will be by using much more invasive methods like using BiPAP machines or intubation and completely taking over the FiO2, which will actually make that particular study far more different in its interpretations, because you will alter the entire steady state by sedating them more, by paralyzing them more, by intubating them more. So 100% oxygen is just for us to understand. It is high flow oxygen. A high flow oxygen, if it is able to increase the FiO2s to 60 to 70%, either 10 to 15 liters by face mask or up to around 2 liters by nasal prongs, that will give whatever be the pulmonary vascular resistance fall, and a fall in the pulmonary artery pressure will happen with that. If the patient is not falling at 70% FiO2, he is very unlikely to fall at 100% FiO2.
I think if there are no more questions, then I think we can end the session. One of the most successful of the recent past which we had. Thank you so much, sir. And I look forward for further meetings with you, and so that our residents all over India, they benefit from your lectures. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sumod, and thank you, Rama.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Mohit.
thanks to all of you, the entire GVPAN team, because this is gave me an opportunity for me to see all of you, Dr. Sumod, Dr. Mohit. Many of you, unfortunately, since I am in the other corner of the country, we hardly got an opportunity to see each other very frequently, and very nice opportunity. I enjoyed the association with you, and hope we get mutually benefited from each other in future.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Same here, sir. Same here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, doctors. Thank you.